In the last video, I discussed this device, the electrically activated, electrically charged sex plug. I want to take this into a useful direction, since we've all got battery-powered butt plugs on the brain right now. And that is context reframes. What is a context reframe? A context reframe is a challenge. The concept challenge, when we use the term challenge in NLP, I think that often creates a subtle distortion, a subtle deviation from maybe the best understanding of challenge. So when NLP talks about challenges, I think we have to stop there. We have to linguistically stop there and start thinking a lot more carefully about what we mean by challenge. Challenge definitely encodes a kind of budding of worldviews, kind of a tough test. You know, this is a challenge, and a lot of that comes from televisual culture. Probably NLP should use a different type of terminology, or a different set of metaphors and a different set of linguistic reference instead of challenge. So we have something called the context reframe, which is, what is this an example of? What is a context reframe an example of? Well, in a sense, it is a challenge to how one interprets or processes a certain snapshot of reality. So the typical context reframe is, can you think of a context in which that might be useful? And a certain number of people may be horrified or finding it, sort of outside of the normal frame of discussion to be talking about something like an electrically powerable erotic gadget. Can you think of a context in which that might be useful? Okay, now here's a really great way to segue in, take one piece of information. That's utilization. So we're going to utilize this introduction of this strange and sort of out of place and out of context new element that has been entered into the ToadCam vocabulary of videos here and images and ideas. Can you think of a context in which that might be useful? Now, I want you to think about something else. The subtle loading of putting the term, can you think of a context? Okay, so can you think of a context in which this image, or can you think of a context in which using a rhetorical device or a visual device like this might be useful? Try this subtle shift. Can you imagine a context in which that might be useful? And I've noticed this, and I think this is somewhat borne out in the way that various temperament testing goes, you know, the various Myers-Briggs testing. Some people think in terms of thinking, and if you're dealing with a thinking person, someone who's very full of thought, and probably someone who's kind of down there in the AD category, can you think of a context in which that might be useful? Might be the right way to sort of open that door and get them to go and explore. Well, you know, I really don't think about, you know, butt plugs as a way of discussing communication. Well, can you think of a context? Well, I don't know. That's really interesting. So then they have to kind of reorient their internal world to, well, you know, what kind of people would understand that? What kind of people would resonate with that? What kind of people would react to that? What kind of people would actually be communicated with and have their internal computation shifted around by using an image or an element that's so outside of sort of standard thinking or standard conversation or our conventions, you might say, sort of the conventions of, you know, how one approaches NLP. Another type of person, though, who might be much more of someone, say, in the visual construct or the auditory construct, might respond much better to, can you imagine a context in which that might be useful? So, you know, one doesn't often in the conventions of NLP training go with electroplugs. That's just not part of conventional NLP. It's a little too loaded with all its own reference. You know, it's simply not that it's this pink and black sort of fascinating sculptural object, which could probably be in the Museum of Modern Art as a sort of modern design, if it didn't have this this intense backloading of what it is theoretically used for. So you could, and if someone were from another culture that never saw such a thing, they might have God knows, a seashell, a ritual object, something like that. So a different type of person might respond to, can you imagine way up there and all this stuff over here, can you imagine a context in which that might be useful? Or there might even be subtler suggestions, at some point between waking and dreaming or waking and sleep, in that wonderful theta state where the mind is very fluid and able to entertain things that it really doesn't during daytime thought. During that time, could you imagine how that might be a very useful communication tool or a very useful communication device in certain contexts? In what context? And then you can use all that sort of outrageousness as a way of actually getting that person to think about contexts and think about other views of reality and other ways of assembling reality, that someone from a completely different background and personal history might actually be able to use that as part of a way of thinking or rethinking or thinking new. So the context reframe, use it or lose it.